Hey, it's Matthew. In this video, I'm covering the biggest frauds on Everest ever, from a content creator staging summit footage and removing his oxygen mask mid-descent, to a speed record attempt that ended in tragedy when the climber used illegal stimulants. It was May 22nd, 2013, during the final weeks of the spring climbing season on Mount Everest. A narrow summit window had opened, compressing dozens of expeditions into the same ascent window. Forecasts showed wind speeds near, but not exceeding, standard cutoff limits. Gusts were expected to intensify along the summit ridge, where airflow accelerates over exposed terrain, but conditions were still classified as climbable. Among them was Daniel Krohn, a 34-year-old outdoor content creator from Germany. He had prior high-altitude experience, including guided ascents of Aconcagua and Denali, and was comfortable moving on fixed lines. Everest, however, carried added pressure. The climb doubled as a career milestone. A small outdoor apparel company had partially funded the expedition, with a clear expectation. Krohn needed photographs that could be read as summit images. Branding visibility mattered more than context. Guides had warned him that congestion near the summit ridge often made clean shots impossible, with ropes and other climbers filling the frame. Later message reviews showed Krohn treated this as a visual problem, not a logistical one. To compensate, he carried an oversized branded flag in his pack, far larger than the small flags typically displayed at the summit. When unfurled, it could block reference points and conceal surrounding traffic. The flag was never declared, approved, or disclosed to guides or rope teams. Just below the summit ridge, near a congested transition, above the balcony, Krohn stopped. Climbers behind him were already waiting, some adjusting oxygen regulators, others filming short clips. Wind moved steadily across the ridge, strong enough to tug at loose straps, but still within forecasted limits. Krohn turned slightly into the wind and unclipped one hand from the fixed rope. He reached into his pack. As the flag cleared the opening, the wind caught it immediately. Instead of hanging slack, the fabric snapped fully open and filled with air. It locked into the airflow like a sail. The force was transferred directly through Krohn's arms and into his harness. His boots slid sideways across hard-packed snow as his center of balance shifted abruptly. Two climbers clipped into the same fixed line were pulled with him. The fixed line system on Everest is designed to absorb downward load along the fall line, not sudden lateral force. As the flag remained fully pressurized, the sideways load traveled through the rope. Anchors began to strain. Snow around the placements fractured. Several climbers later reported hearing a sharp, cracking sound as the first anchor shifted. The rope recoiled violently. A second anchor tore free moments later. With no gradual release, the system failed under combined lateral and tensile load. Three climbers were pulled off the route almost simultaneously. One fell backward down the Kangshung-facing side and disappeared into clouds within seconds. Another was dragged forward, struck exposed rock, and vanished over a break in the ridge. Krohn was yanked sideways by the still-filled flag, spun once, and then dropped as the fabric tore loose and fluttered downslope. Movement on the route stopped immediately. Guides above secured themselves to the remaining fixed lines and held position. No descent or recovery attempt was made. At that altitude, with steep terrain, unstable footing, and hundreds of meters of exposure, any intervention would have placed additional climbers at risk. The route was later stabilized, and a formal review followed. Inspections confirmed the rope, anchors, and hardware met Everest standards, and wind conditions were within forecast limits, with no storm recorded. Investigators traced the failure to unauthorized equipment and intentional misrepresentation. The final report concluded that an oversized, undeclared flag was used to falsely suggest summit proximity, and that deploying it created a sideways wind load the fixed line system was never designed to handle. The flag was later recovered, downslope, shredded, and frozen. 3 fatalities were attributed to fixed line failure caused by fraudulent equipment, with no fault found in the route, anchors, or the mountain itself. It was April 29th, 2017, and Everest Base Camp sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier at 17,600 feet under a crystalline morning sky. The temperature was held at 19 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exhaled breath hung visible in the thin air, but warm enough that climbers moved between tents without full expedition suits. The camp had swelled to nearly 800 people during the peak preparation window. Clients, guides, Sherpas, cooks, medical staff, and the support personnel required to sustain what had become a seasonal industry. Diesel generators hummed steadily, powering communications equipment and charging stations. Prayer flags stretched between clusters of tents, their colors vivid against the monochrome landscape of rock and ice. Among the arriving climbers was Chelsea Monroe, a 24-year-old from Los Angeles, whose TikTok account had grown from 12,000 followers to nearly 480,000 over the previous 14 months. Chelsea had built her audience through aspirational lifestyle content, luxury travel, fitness routines, motivational messaging about pushing boundaries and refusing to accept limitations. Her feed presented a curated narrative of transformation, positioning her as someone who had chosen adventure over comfort and achievement over complacency. The aesthetic was carefully constructed. Every post was color-graded for maximum impact, every caption workshopped for engagement, every location selected for its visual drama. Everest represented the apex of that narrative. Chelsea had announced the expedition 3 months earlier with a professionally produced video that featured training footage, sponsor acknowledgements, and emotional reflection about proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. The video generated 2 million views and 16,000 comments, most expressing admiration and support. What the video did not mention was that Chelsea's climbing experience consisted of a single guided trek up Kilimanjaro completed 11 months earlier. She had no technical mountaineering training, no experience with fixed ropes or crampons, and no understanding of high-altitude physiology beyond what she had absorbed from YouTube videos and expedition blogs. Chelsea had paid $68,000 to join a commercial expedition operated by Summit Quest, a mid-tier guiding company that marketed itself as accessible to climbers with limited experience. The company's pitch emphasized support rather than prerequisites, promising that skilled Sherpas and Western guides would manage technical challenges while clients focused on endurance and determination. Chelsea's medical screening had been cursory, a questionnaire completed online and a single video call with an expedition coordinator who asked whether she had any serious health conditions. When asked about previous climbing experience, Chelsea described Kilimanjaro in language that suggested more technical complexity than the mountain actually required. The coordinator accepted her application without further verification. Her assigned Sherpa was Pemba Nuru, 31, a climber from Forts Village who had summited Everest 7 times across 9 years of guiding. Pemba supported his parents, 2 younger sisters, and his own 3 children on income earned during the brief climbing season. He had learned to read clients quickly, assessing their fitness, their judgment, their capacity to follow instructions under stress. Within 2 days of meeting Chelsea at base camp, Pemba understood she was underprepared. She moved slowly during acclimatization hikes. Her breathing labored at relatively modest altitudes. Her questions revealed gaps in basic mountaineering knowledge. She asked whether crampons were required for the entire climb, whether she would need to carry her own oxygen bottles, and whether helicopter evacuation was available from the summit. But Chelsea's social media presence was seamless. Her TikTok posts from base camp showed her laughing with other climbers, completing yoga poses against mountain backdrops, and delivering inspirational messages about embracing fear and trusting the process. The videos were edited to emphasize confidence and capability. She posted training footage that had been filmed weeks earlier in Los Angeles, presenting it as current preparation. Her followers had no reason to doubt the narrative she was constructing. The comments sections were filled with encouragement, with strangers telling her she was brave, that she was inspiring them to pursue their own challenges. The first acclimatization rotation began on May 3rd. The route through the Khumbu icefall required navigating a chaotic maze of crevasses, ice blocks, and aluminum ladders that shifted daily as the glacier ground downslope at roughly 3 feet per day. The route gained approximately 2,000 vertical feet from base camp to Camp 1, with the worst hazards concentrated in sections where unstable seracs towered overhead and crevasses widened into slots that disappeared into blue shadow. Teams departed before dawn to minimize time in the danger zone, while the ice remained cold and stable. Chelsea struggled badly, the physical effort of ascending with crampons and a pack, the altitude sapping her strength, the exposure creating fear that slowed her movement. All of it combined into a grinding ordeal that required nearly 8 hours to complete a route that most clients finished in 4. Pemba stayed with her throughout, offering encouragement and managing her safety, but he could see that her body was not adapting to the altitude as it needed to. Her breathing remained rapid and shallow even during rests. Her coordination was impaired, her foot placements uncertain. At one ladder, crossing over a particularly wide crevasse, she froze halfway across, paralyzed by the flex of the aluminum and the bottomless void below. Pemba had to talk her through each step, his voice calm and steady, while the rope team behind them waited with growing impatience. That evening at Camp 1, Chelsea posted a video that presented the climb as challenging but manageable, describing it as the hardest thing she had ever done, but emphasizing that her training had prepared her adequately. She did not mention the 8-hour duration or the moments of paralysis. She did not show the footage where Pemba had to physically guide her crampons onto ladder rungs. The video showed only her success, her determination, her smile as she raised a gloved fist toward the camera with Everest's upper slopes visible behind her. The post generated 43,000 likes and nearly 2,000 comments within 12 hours. The second rotation to Camp 2 revealed the same pattern. Chelsea moved slowly through the western Sai-Wnim, the vast glacial valley that stretched for miles between the towering walls of Nuptse and Lhotse. The route crossed crevasse fields and traversed sections where the glacier's movement created unpredictable hazards. Chelsea required frequent rests, her face flushed despite the cold, her movements increasingly mechanical. After warming her hands inside his jacket and waiting for a stable reading, Pemba checked her oxygen saturation and found it at 69%, concerningly low, though not immediately dangerous. He explained that her body was struggling to acclimatize, that the numbers should be higher at this stage of the rotation schedule. He recommended additional rest days at base camp before attempting the next rotation to Camp 3. Chelsea's response was defensive. She insisted she felt fine, that the breathing difficulty was normal for this altitude, and that Pemba was being overly cautious. She asked whether other clients had similar numbers, and seemed to interpret Pemba's concern as doubt about her capability, rather than legitimate medical observation. That evening, she posted content describing the day's climb as difficult but successful, making no mention of her oxygen saturation readings or Pemba's recommendations. Her narrative remained consistent. She was pushing through challenges, adapting to the mountain, proving that determination could overcome obstacles. Also climbing with Summit Quest was Marcus Chan, 41, an emergency room physician from Seattle who had completed multiple high-altitude expeditions, including Denali, Aconcagua, and Cho Oyu. Marcus had summited Cho Oyu the previous year, reaching 26,864 feet without supplemental oxygen, demonstrating exceptional acclimatization capacity. His approach to climbing emphasized preparation and caution. He had trained rigorously, reviewed medical literature on high-altitude physiology, and approached Everest with respect for its dangers. Marcus was climbing with his assigned Sherpa, Lakpat Sering, 38, who had completed 13 Everest summits and was regarded as one of the most experienced guides working for Summit Quest. The third member was Sarah Lindstrom, 37, a high school teacher from Minnesota attempting her first 8,000-meter peak. Sarah had climbed Island Peak and Mara Peak in previous years, building a solid foundation of high-altitude experience. She was fit, cautious, and keenly aware of her limitations. Her assigned Sherpa was Dawa Gyaljan, 29, completing his 6th Everest season. The three clients became acquainted during rest days at base camp, sharing meals and discussing their preparations. Chelsea positioned herself as part of this group, posting photos with Marcus and Sarah that suggested camaraderie and shared capability. Marcus and Sarah were polite but maintained professional distance, both recognizing that Chelsea's experience level did not match their own. The critical rotation to Camp 3 occurred on May 11th. The climb from Camp 2 required ascending the Lhotse face, a steep blue ice wall that rose more than 2,000 vertical feet at angles between 40 and 50 degrees. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained cardiovascular effort and technical competence. Chelsea reached Camp 3 after 9 hours of climbing that left her completely exhausted. After warming her hands and taking multiple readings to confirm the result, her oxygen saturation at Camp 3 measured 62%, a number that placed her in dangerous territory. Pemba insisted they descend immediately, that continuing with these numbers would risk pulmonary or cerebral edema. Chelsea refused. She had not paid $70,000 to quit before the summit. She had trained for this. She had promised her followers she would reach the top. Descending now would destroy the narrative she had built over 14 months. She accused Pemba of undermining her confidence, of treating her differently from male climbers, of failing to provide the support she had paid for. The argument became heated enough that other climbers could hear raised voices from inside Chelsea's tent. Pemba radioed the expedition leader at base camp and explained the situation. The response was bureaucratic and unsatisfying. Chelsea had signed comprehensive liability waivers. Her vital signs were concerning but not immediately life-threatening, and forcing her descent would create legal and reputational complications for the company. Unless she became obviously incapacitated, the decision to continue was legally hers to make. Pemba was advised to document his concerns and continue providing support. The descent from Camp 3 to Camp 2 the following morning went slowly but without incident. Chelsea managed the technical sections adequately, and they reached Camp 2 in the early afternoon. They continued to base camp the next day to rest before the summit window. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel. Make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. The weather window opened on May 18th. Meteorologists predicted a brief 36-hour period of reduced winds before another storm system moved in. Summit Quest finalized its climbing roster. Marcus and Sarah were cleared to attempt the summit, both having demonstrated excellent acclimatization and technical competence. Chelsea was explicitly excluded. Her oxygen saturation readings, her 9-hour ascent times, and her near paralysis on technical terrain made her a liability the company was unwilling to accept. The expedition leader delivered the news in person, explaining that she could attempt the summit in a future season after gaining more experience. Chelsea's response was immediate and calculated. She threatened to destroy Summit Quest's reputation across every platform where she had influence. She would post videos describing how the company had taken her money, led her to believe she would be supported, and then abandoned her within sight of the summit. She would name Pemba specifically as the guide who had undermined her from the beginning. She would ensure that her 480,000 followers understood exactly how she had been treated. The expedition leader held firm. Chelsea was not climbing. What happened next bypassed Summit Quest entirely. Chelsea approached a smaller budget operator, camped nearby, a company running a bare-bones expedition with minimal oversight and maximum flexibility. She offered $15,000 in cash for a spot on their summit roster. No questions asked. The operator, facing a season with fewer clients than projected, accepted the payment. Chelsea would climb with their team, using their Sherpa support, following their schedule. Summit Quest would not be involved or liable. The budget operator assigned Chelsea to climb with Dorje Lama, a 34-year-old Sherpa with 4 Everest summits, who had never worked with this client and knew nothing about her medical history or performance during acclimatization. He was told only that she was an experienced climber, transferring from another expedition. Chelsea told him her oxygen saturation had been reading in the high 70s throughout the rotation, a lie that would prove catastrophic. Dorje had heard rumors circulating through base camp about a social media climber who had been banned from her original expedition, but he had no reason to connect those rumors to the confident American woman now assigned to his rope. The budget operator had not shared details, and Dorje had not asked. In commercial guiding, clients came and went, and questions about why someone had switched expeditions were rarely welcomed. He assumed she had disagreed with her previous company over scheduling or fees, personality conflicts that happened every season. He did not assume she had been deemed medically unfit to climb. The summit push began on the evening of May 19th. Teams departed Camp 4 at staggered intervals, headlamps creating a serpentine chain of light ascending the southeast ridge. Chelsea started strong, the supplemental oxygen masking some of her body's distress, but her pace began deteriorating above the balcony at 27,600 feet. She stopped every 40 feet, her breathing ragged even through the oxygen mask, her legs trembling with each step. By the time she reached 28,000 feet, she had fallen far behind her assigned team. Dorje stayed with her, growing increasingly concerned as her condition deteriorated. Other climbing teams began stacking up behind them on the fixed ropes. The route narrowed to a single line in several sections, and Chelsea's glacial pace was creating a bottleneck that affected everyone ascending behind her. Marcus, Sarah, and their Sherpas were among those trapped in the growing queue. What should have been a steady climb became a stop-and-start ordeal, with teams waiting 10 and 15 minutes at a time, while Chelsea struggled through sections that competent climbers cleared in moments. The delays pushed everyone's timeline backward, consuming the safety margin that separated a successful summit from a fatal one. At 28,200 feet, approximately 600 feet below the summit, Chelsea collapsed. She sat down on the fixed line, her legs folded beneath her, and did not respond when Dorja urged her to stand. Her eyes were unfocused, her speech slurred when she spoke at all. The signs of cerebral edema were unmistakable. Her brain was swelling from the altitude, and without immediate descent, she would die. But Chelsea was blocking the only route. The fixed line ran through a narrow traverse where climbers could not easily pass, and her position made it impossible for ascending teams to continue or for descending teams to get through efficiently. Dorja radioed for help, his voice tight with controlled panic. Climbers began stacking up on both sides of the blockage, some trying to summit, others trying to descend before conditions deteriorated further. The mathematics of the situation was brutal. Every minute spent stationary at 28,200 feet cost climbers oxygen they could not replace and body heat they could not regenerate. The human body consumes roughly 4 liters of bottled oxygen per minute at that altitude, with regulators set to standard flow rates. The teams stacked behind Chelsea were burning through their supplies while accomplishing nothing, watching their survival margins shrink with each passing moment. Some climbers had planned their oxygen loads down to the hour. Those plans were now meaningless. Dawa Gyaltsen moved forward to help. He had been climbing behind Sarah when the bottleneck formed, and his instinct was to assist however he could. He clipped into the fixed line beside Chelsea and began trying to lift her, to move her to a position where other climbers could pass. The situation was chaotic. Multiple people shouting instructions, the wind building steadily, the cold sapping everyone's reserves. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. As Dawa struggled with Chelsea's weight, she lurched sideways in a moment of confused resistance, her arm swinging outward and catching Dawa across the chest. The impact was not forceful, but at 28,200 feet, on a narrow traverse with a 40-degree ice slope falling away below, it was enough. Dawa's crampon points skittered on the hard-packed snow. His grip on the fixed rope slipped. He fell backward, his safety tether shock-loading against an anchor that was already bearing the weight of multiple climbers. The anchor held. Dawa's tether did not. The carabiner gate, stressed beyond its design limits by the angular load, failed catastrophically. Dawa Gyaltsen fell more than 800 feet down the southeast face, his body disappearing into the gray void before anyone could react. His remains were never recovered. The chaos that followed was absolute. Climbers who had witnessed the fall were screaming. Others were trying to push past Chelsea's still motionless form to begin their own descent. The carefully coordinated summit push had collapsed into every man for himself survival. Pemba was not supposed to be there. After Chelsea was banned from Summit Quest's roster, he had been reassigned to support the Summit team, carrying extra oxygen and emergency supplies, a role that placed him above Camp 4 during the window. When Dawa fell, Pemba was 300 feet below, ascending with cached bottles. He heard the commotion on the radio and pushed upward to help. What Pemba found was a disaster in progress. Chelsea was barely conscious, blocking the route. Dorja was overwhelmed, trying to manage his client while other climbers shoved past. Marcus and Lakpa were attempting to coordinate an orderly descent, but the traffic jam had made efficient movement impossible. Sarah was showing early signs of altitude sickness, confusion, slowed responses that would worsen rapidly if she remained at this elevation. Pemba took charge because someone had to. He physically lifted Chelsea and moved her to a small platform off the main route, clearing the fixed line for other climbers. He directed traffic, telling ascending teams to turn back immediately, creating space for descending climbers to move. He burned through his own energy reserves doing work that should have been shared among multiple Sherpas, but the others were scattered across the mountain, dealing with their own emergencies. The descent became a running battle against time. Sarah's condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. The cerebral edema that had begun as confusion and slowed responses progressed into something worse. She began speaking to people who were not there, asking Lakpa questions about her classroom in Minnesota, calling him by her father's name. By 27,500 feet, Lakpa was essentially dragging her, her legs moving in mechanical steps, but her mind no longer connected to her body. Her eyes were open, but she saw nothing on the mountain. Whatever Sarah was experiencing in her final hours existed somewhere far from the southeast ridge. Marcus helped where he could, but his own oxygen was running low, and the cold was beginning to affect his coordination. Chelsea was being half-carried by Dorja and another Sherpa who had descended from above, her weight slowing everyone behind her. At 27,000 feet, Sarah stopped breathing. Lakpa checked for a pulse and found nothing. He attempted rescue breathing, but at that altitude, with that level of oxygen deprivation, There was nothing to be done. They left her body clipped to the fixed line and continued down. Pemba reached Camp 4 at 11 in the morning, more than 12 hours after the summit push began. He had been above 26,000 feet for nearly 20 hours, far longer than the human body could sustain without consequences. His oxygen had run out 2 hours earlier. His movements were uncoordinated, his speech slurred, his skin showing the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia. He collapsed outside a tent and did not get up. Other climbers found him 40 minutes later. They dragged him inside, forced warm fluids into him, and covered him with sleeping bags. His core temperature had dropped to 87 degrees Fahrenheit. His heart was beating erratically, struggling to pump blood that had thickened in the cold. At 2:47 p.m., surrounded by climbers who had done everything they could, Pemba Nuru's heart stopped. He was 31 years old. Sarah Lindstrom's body remained on the upper southeast ridge for the remainder of the season, clipped to the fixed rope just below 27,000 feet. Recovery was deemed impossible given her position, the weather, and the continued congestion on the route. Marcus Chen made it down to Camp 2 alive, but his condition continued to deteriorate. Despite supplemental oxygen and aggressive warming, Marcus's breathing worsened overnight, turning rapid and wet as fluid filled his lungs. At 21,200 feet, his oxygen levels continued to fall despite maximum flow. In the early hours of May 21st, Marcus went into cardiac arrest inside his tent at Camp 2. Resuscitation efforts failed. He was pronounced dead shortly after sunrise. The official cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema, compounded by prolonged hypoxia. He was 41 years old. Chelsea Monroe survived. She was evacuated by helicopter from Camp 2 the following day, suffering from severe frostbite and the lingering effects of cerebral edema. She lost 2 fingers on her left hand and portions of 3 toes. She never reached the summit of Everest. Lakpa Tsering survived with similar injuries. 8 other climbers died during the same weather window, pushing the season's death toll to 11, one of the deadliest in recent Everest history. The investigation cited multiple contributing factors, including weather, overcrowding, inadequate screening, and cascading delays caused by an unqualified climber during the summit window. Chelsea's name appeared in the final report, though no charges were filed. The families of Dawa Gyaltsen and Pemba Nuru each received $15,000 in expedition insurance, roughly 3 years of guiding income. Pemba's 3 children moved in with his parents in Forts Village. Sarah Lindstrom's family received her personal effects. Marcus Chen's body was returned to the United States, his death recorded as the result of high-altitude exposure during rescue efforts. It was May 23, 2016, during the spring summit window on Mount Everest, when a brief shift in the jet stream lowered wind speeds enough for climbers to move above the South Col. Fixed ropes were already in place, oxygen bottles had been staged, and teams were spaced out to avoid congestion. Above 26,000 feet, climbing depends on systems working exactly as planned, with little margin for error. One of the climbers was Daniel Mercer, a 29-year-old content creator from British Columbia. He had endurance and alpine experience, was attempting his first 8,000-meter peak. He climbed independently, without a guide or Sherpa, aiming to document what he promoted online as a solo Everest summit. In the days before the summit window, Mercer posted tightly framed clips that appeared to place him near the Hillary Step. Later review showed the footage was filmed lower, near the south summit, where angles can exaggerate steepness and hide exposure. The videos were uploaded with delays to appear live. As viewers questioned inconsistencies in timing and terrain, Mercer announced he would live stream his descent to prove the claim. At that altitude, removing supplemental oxygen causes rapid hypoxic impairment, speech degradation, delayed reactions, and loss of coordination often appear before the climber recognizes the risk. Removing it will lead to hypoxia almost immediately. The first effects are subtle: slower reactions, reduced coordination, and changes in speech. Judgment often fades last, which is why climbers may feel capable even as their abilities decline. During his descent from the south summit, Mercer began a helmet-mounted live stream. Archived footage showed him stopping on the fixed line, turning toward the camera and pulling his oxygen mask away to speak. Wind was steady but manageable. Within seconds, his speech slowed, words became uneven, and he paused mid-sentence. 3 climbers later said he stopped longer than expected in that section. One described his movements as deliberate but delayed, with his hands hovering before each action. Another reported that Mercer waved them through after briefly blocking the line. About 2 minutes into the live stream, Mercer's hands began to tremble. He tried to manage the rope and camera at the same time while adjusting his stance. Frame-by-frame review later showed him bringing a second carabiner toward the fixed line with the gate oriented incorrectly, causing a cross-load instead of a proper spine load. As he shifted his feet, his crampons scraped across hard, wind-packed snow without setting. The load transferred suddenly. One carabiner released under tension. The remaining connection pulled him sideways, and the camera jolted. The rope snapped tight and vibrated as the live stream captured a burst of wind and a brief metallic sound before the image dissolved into white and gray. Investigators later estimated he fell roughly 600 feet down the Kongshung-facing slope based on GPS data, terrain features, and witness accounts. Climbers reported seeing debris drop from the cloud layer moments later, followed by the fixed rope going slack. The live stream continued briefly, broadcasting only wind before the connection failed. No rescue was possible. His last position was far below the route on steep, exposed terrain, and any recovery attempt would have placed additional climbers at risk. The incident was recorded by several expeditions within minutes and reported through standard channels to Nepalese authorities. Daniel Mercer was listed as deceased at altitude, and no recovery attempt was approved due to the location of the fall and continued exposure risks. His body was not recovered. In the weeks that followed, a formal review was conducted using the evidence that was available. Investigators examined archived live stream footage, GPS data transmitted before the fall, weather records, and statements from climbers positioned above and below Mercer on the route. Witness statements aligned with the footage, confirming that Mercer stopped on the fixed line, removed his oxygen mask, and remained stationary longer than normal for that section. The live stream footage itself became the primary source of evidence. The report found that voluntary oxygen removal likely caused hypoxic impairment, slowing reactions and reducing coordination during a moment when Mercer was handling multiple tasks, preventing him from recognizing the incorrect clip before applying weight. The death was recorded as a fatal fall, with hypoxia listed as a contributing factor. There were no rule violations, no equipment defects, and no sudden environmental trigger. It was April 12, 2017, and Everest Base Camp sat at 17,600 feet on the broken surface of the Khumbu Glacier, a tent city of more than 300 climbers spread across moraine and ice beneath the looming chaos of the Khumbu icefall. Spring light warmed the glacier by midday, sending meltwater trickling through gravel channels between expedition clusters. Prayer flags snapped in wind that carried the smell of ice and the faint hum of generators from the larger mess tents. Above camp, the icefall rose in a cascade of seracs and crevasses, the route already fixed with ropes and aluminum ladders. Beyond that, the western SAWM, the Lhotse face, and the summit pyramid that caught the last light each evening in a way that made it look deceptively close. The season was building toward the narrow weather windows that May would deliver, and every expedition at base camp was running the same calculation. Weeks of preparation, compressed into a handful of days where the mountain might allow passage to the top. Among those preparing was Niels Dekker, a 29-year-old from Utrecht, Netherlands, who arrived at base camp with the easy confidence of someone who believed he had already proven himself on the world's highest peaks. He was fit, charismatic, and photogenic, the kind of person who made mountaineering look aspirational rather than desperate. His social media following of roughly 55,000 had been built on a carefully constructed narrative of adventure and achievement, with professional quality summit photos, motivational captions, and branded gear from 2 outdoor equipment companies that sponsored him based on the resume he presented. That resume claimed 3 8,000-meter summits by the age of 28, Cho Oyu in 2014, Manaslu in 2015, and Broad Peak in 2016. For a young, independent climber without family wealth or institutional backing, the progression was impressive enough to earn respect from operators, sponsors, and the climbing community at large. Niels moved through base camp with the bearing of someone accustomed to that respect, shaking hands, exchanging route knowledge, discussing conditions with the authority of a person who had stood on top of 3 of the world's 14 highest mountains. He had not stood on top of any of them. Niels Dekker was not incompetent. He was a genuinely strong climber who performed well at altitude, moved efficiently on technical terrain, and had the cardiovascular fitness to reach high camps on 8,000-meter peaks without assistance beyond standard Sherpa support. His fraud was not about inability. It was about the last 5 to 10%, the final push from a high point to the true summit that separated a strong climb from a completed one. Each time, when conditions deteriorated or his body reached its limit in the final stretch, Niels accepted the turnaround, and each time, before descending, he positioned himself carefully, framed his camera and photographed himself at the high point in a way that made it indistinguishable from the top. The deception lived in the caption, not the climb. On Cho Oyu in 2014, he had turned around at approximately 26,000 feet, roughly 800 feet below the summit, when weather closed in and his Sherpa recommended descent. The clouds that forced the turnaround also served the fraud perfectly. They obscured the terrain above his position, making it impossible from the photograph alone to determine exactly where he was standing. He posted the image with a summit caption, and the engagement that followed, the congratulations, the sponsorship interest, the follower growth, taught him that the difference between a high point and a summit existed only in the minds of people who had been there, and almost nobody who saw his content had been there. On Manaslu in 2015, he reached approximately 25,800 feet before his body simply couldn't produce what the remaining 1,000 vertical feet demanded. His Sherpa recommended descent, and Niels agreed without argument. Before turning around, he positioned himself with the summit ridge behind him at an angle that, to anyone who hadn't stood on Manaslu's true summit, looked identical to the top. The photo was convincing. The caption was confident. The comments were celebratory. No one questioned it. On Broad Peak in 2016, the fraud was almost unnecessary. Broad Peak's false summit at approximately 26,400 feet sits so close in elevation and appearance to the true summit at 26,414 feet that legitimate climbers have genuinely believed they completed the ascent after reaching it. The dangerous traverse between the two, an exposed ridge with significant avalanche risk, separated them by only 14 vertical feet, but by a gap in commitment that many climbers declined to cross. Niels reached the false summit, knew it was not the true top, and photographed himself there anyway. Of all his fabrications, this was the most defensible, the one where even honest climbers had made the same mistake unknowingly. Niels made it knowingly, and the distinction existed only inside his own head. The system that enabled the fraud was simple and structural. Summit verification in mountaineering is largely honor-based. There is no centralized authority that confirms whether a climber stood on the true summit versus a nearby high point. Summit photos are the primary evidence, and the people who could identify the difference, climbers who had actually stood on those specific summits, represented a tiny fraction of Niels' audience. The vast majority of his 55,000 followers could not distinguish the south summit of Everest from the true summit, the false summit of Broad Peak from the real one, or a high camp on Manaslu from the top. They saw a man in mountaineering gear standing above clouds with a panoramic backdrop, and they believed what the caption told them. The second structural element was isolation. Niels used a different operator for each expedition, different companies, different Sherpas, different support teams. The individual Sherpa who guided him on Cho Oyu knew that Niels had turned around 800 feet below the summit, but that Sherpa had no connection to the Sherpa who guided him on Manaslu or the one on Broad Peak. Each guide saw a single data point, one client who turned around on one mountain, and none of them followed Niels' social media or had reason to contradict a paying client's post-expedition claims. The fraud survived because the witnesses were siloed. Each one knew a piece of the truth. None of them had the full picture. Niels' Everest guide was Pemba Chering, 36 years old, from Namche Bazaar, a veteran of 13 years in the guiding profession with 7 Everest summits behind him. He was professional, experienced, and direct in the way that guides with extensive client histories tended to be, patient with legitimate questions, intolerant of unnecessary risk, and skilled at reading a client's true capacity beneath whatever confidence they projected. He supported a wife and 3 children, his eldest son requiring regular treatment in Kathmandu for a chronic respiratory condition that consumed a significant portion of seasonal income. Pemba had no reason to doubt Neil's qualifications. A client with 3 claimed 8,000-meter summits at 29 years old warranted a strong but standard guide, not close supervision, not the gentle management that inexperienced clients required. The operator assigned Pemba to Niels based on the resume, and Pemba accepted the assignment with the expectation that this would be a straightforward season with a capable client. The first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet confirmed the expectation. Niels climbed well, strong pace, efficient movement, controlled breathing on the fixed ropes through the icefall. He handled the ladder crossings with the familiarity of someone who had done this kind of terrain before, and his physical conditioning was evident in the way he maintained rhythm on the steeper sections, without the excessive rest stops that less prepared climbers required. Pemba noted the ability and adjusted his assessment accordingly. Whatever this client needed, it wasn't help getting up the mountain. What Pemba also noticed, without attaching significance to it, was Niels's relationship with his camera. Most clients photographed the icefall, the views, the camps. Niels did this too, but with an additional layer of attention that went beyond documentation. He studied angles. He positioned himself relative to terrain features and shot test frames from multiple positions, checking the results on his camera screen with the critical eye of someone composing rather than simply recording. At Camp 1, he spent 20 minutes photographing the view upward toward the western CWM and the Lhotse face, adjusting his position repeatedly to change how the terrain framed behind him. Pemba interpreted this as the behavior of someone who took their social media seriously. It was not unusual. Many clients curated their expedition content carefully. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet and the third to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet reinforced both Niels's physical credibility and his photographic obsession. He climbed well at every stage. His body adapted efficiently. His movements on the Lhotse face were controlled and confident, and his oxygen saturation readings remained strong. He was one of the more capable clients on the mountain, and nothing in his performance suggested that his claimed resume was anything other than accurate. At Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, Niels spent the rest period studying the terrain above through binoculars rather than sleeping. He examined the upper mountain in detail, the south col, the southeast ridge, the balcony, and the distinctive profile of the south summit, and the final ridge leading to the true summit. He photographed the view from multiple positions and angles, paying particular attention to how the south summit related visually to the true summit from below. The corniced ridge connecting them, the knife-edged traverse, the Hillary step, was visible as a dramatic line against the sky. From Camp 3, the relationship between the two was clear. From the south summit itself, the perspective would be different, and that difference was what Niels was already calculating. Pemba noticed the extended study session and asked if Niels was assessing route conditions. Niels responded that he was familiarizing himself with the upper mountain, so that summit day felt like terrain he already knew. The answer was plausible and unremarkable. Pemba accepted it and returned to melting snow for water. What he did not know was that Niels was solving a specific problem: how to photograph himself at the south summit in a way that would pass for the true summit when posted online. And the problem was harder than any he had solved on his previous peaks. The weather window opened on May 18th. The push from base camp to Camp 4 took 2 days with overnight stops at Camp 2 and Camp 3. Niels climbed well on the approach, his pace dictated by the deliberate rhythm that experienced altitude climbers adopted to conserve energy for the summit push. At Camp 3, he was focused, but not anxious, the body language of someone who understood the process and trusted the system. The system, of course, was his own. Climb high, accept the turnaround, take the photo, post the caption. Everest was the biggest stage, but the performance was the same. They reached Camp 4 on the South Col at approximately 26,000 feet on the afternoon of May 20th, a bleak, wind-hammered shelf of rock and ice where the air held roughly 40% of sea-level oxygen. Tents were anchored against gusts that swept across the col with unpredictable violence, their fabric snapping so hard the sound carried over the wind. Spindrift filled vestibules with fine crystals that melted against skin and refroze on fabric. The col felt less like a camp and more like a waiting room between the mountain below and the death zone above, a place where climbers rested without recovering, ate without appetite, and stared at tent walls while their bodies quietly deteriorated. Pemba checked Neil's condition. Oxygen saturation with supplemental flow read in the low 70s, acceptable for the altitude. Physical condition appeared strong. The summit push would proceed. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. Niels lay in his sleeping bag as wind battered the tent, and for the first time during the expedition, he confronted something his previous peaks had not required him to face. Camp 4 on Everest sat at 26,000 feet, 400 feet below his highest previous point on Broad Peak's false summit. The summit push would take him to 28,700 feet at the south summit, and potentially higher if he needed to move along the ridge for the right photo angle. That was 2,300 feet above anything his body had ever experienced. His previous frauds had all occurred at or near his physical ceiling. High points where turning around was both the honest and the necessary decision. Everest's south summit would push him into genuinely unknown territory. The altitude above 28,000 feet was different in ways that no amount of fitness or previous experience could fully prepare for, and Niels was about to discover that difference firsthand. The summit push departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 20th. Clear sky, stars dense in the thin atmosphere, wind manageable on the Col, temperature near minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, before wind chill. Other teams departed in the same window, headlamps forming a scattered chain of light ascending toward the southeast ridge. Niels climbed well through the early hours. The route from Camp 4 gained altitude steadily, through snow and rock terrain, and his conditioning carried him at a pace that kept him with the stronger climbers. Pemba climbed ahead, setting the rhythm, glancing back periodically to confirm his client was maintaining. The supplemental oxygen hissed through the regulator, and crampons bit into hardpack with each step. They reached the balcony at approximately 27,600 feet around 3 a.m. Niels was still moving well, though Pemba noted a slight slowing in his pace that was consistent with the altitude, rather than any specific problem. They continued up the southeast ridge as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. The light revealed the full scale of what surrounded them. The summit pyramid above, sharp and white against deepening blue sky, and below, the south col shrinking into a gray smudge thousands of feet down. Other climbers were visible on the ridge as dark shapes moving at intervals, each one locked into the private battle that altitude imposed. The wind carried ice crystals that caught the early light and scattered it in brief, sharp flashes. The mountain was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, indifferent to the people moving across it, stunning regardless of whether anyone survived to describe it. Above 28,000 feet, Niels entered territory his body had never known. The altitude hit differently than anything on Cho Oyu, Manaslu, or Broad Peak, all of which topped out below this elevation. His breathing grew more labored despite the supplemental oxygen. His pace dropped noticeably. 20 steps between rest stops, then 15, then 10. His movements on the fixed rope became deliberate in a way that reflected effort rather than confidence. The air at 28,000 feet contained roughly a third of sea level oxygen, and his body was processing the deficit in real time with no previous adaptation to draw on. Pemba monitored the deterioration without alarm. Many strong climbers slowed dramatically above 28,000 feet. It was the nature of extreme altitude, rather than a sign of failure. Niels was struggling but functioning, and the pace, while slow, was still productive. They reached the south summit at approximately 28,700 feet, around 5:30 a.m., as dawn flooded the Himalaya in pale gold. The view from the south summit was staggering, the Tibetan plateau stretching north, the Kangshung face dropping away to the east, and directly ahead, the cornice ridge curving towards the Hillary Step and the true summit, approximately 330 vertical feet above. The ridge was unmistakable, even through the fatigue and the thin air. Niels could see the problem he had studied from Camp 3, confirmed in person. The continuing ridge toward the true summit was visible from every angle on the established route at the south summit. The knife-edge cornice, the rocky step, the final slope, all of it stretched above and ahead in a configuration that was one of the most photographed and recognized stretches of terrain in mountaineering. A photograph taken from the standard position at the south summit would clearly show the ridge continuing upward. Anyone with basic Everest knowledge, and millions of people had it, would recognize immediately that the photo was taken at the south summit, not the top. His previous peaks had not presented this problem. Cho Oyu's summit area was obscured by clouds. Manaslu's summit ridge was unfamiliar to most viewers. Broad Peak's false summit was visually identical to the true one, but Everest's final ridge was iconic. The fraud required a different angle, one that eliminated the continuing ridge from the frame and made the south summit look like the highest point. Conditions were deteriorating. Wind had increased from manageable to uncomfortable, pushing spindrift across the ridge in sheets. Cloud was building to the west. Pemba assessed the situation and recommended turning around. They were past conservative turnaround time. Conditions were worsening, and the true summit was still 330 vertical feet away across the most exposed terrain on the route. Niels agreed without resistance. This was his pattern. Accept the call, work within it. The turnaround was both physically necessary and professionally familiar. Pemba began preparing for the descent. He moved onto the fixed line below the south summit, checking anchors and positioning himself for the down climb that would take them back through the southeast ridge toward the balcony in Camp 4. Before following, Niels told Pemba he needed a minute to take photographs. The request was unremarkable. Clients photographed at high points on every expedition, and Pemba acknowledged it with a nod before turning his attention to the descent route below. Niels was alone on the south summit with his camera and the problem that had followed him from Camp 3. From the established route, every angle included the ridge above, the cornice traverse, the rocky step, the final summit slope. They occupied the frame, no matter how he positioned himself. The only direction that offered what he needed was east, along the ridge toward the Kangshung face, where a slight rise in the cornice snow would block the view of the continuing ridge if he moved far enough along it. He unclipped from the fixed line and moved along the ridge toward the east. The snow beneath his crampons looked solid, white, wind-packed, the same surface he had been climbing on all morning. He moved carefully, aware of the exposure, but focused on the angle. Each step along the ridge changed the visual relationship between his position and the summit above. 10 feet from the fixed line, the ridge was still visible. 20 feet, and the corniced rise began to obscure the lower portion. 30 feet, and the angle was nearly right. The continuing ridge was blocked by the snow feature to his left, and behind him, the Himalayan panorama spread in a sweep that would make any photograph look like the top of the world. He stopped. This was the angle. He positioned his ice axe upright in the snow beside him, removed his goggles to show his face clearly, and raised his camera. Below, Pemba had moved several body lengths down the fixed line when something made him look back up toward the south summit. What he saw sent adrenaline through exhaustion. Niels was off the fixed line, standing on the corniced ridge, 30 feet from the established route, on terrain that Pemba recognized immediately as the overhanging edge of the Kangshung face. He shouted. At 28,700 feet, in wind that was pushing 20 miles per hour across the ridge, the sound covered a fraction of the distance before it dissolved. Pemba began climbing back up the fixed line towards the south summit. He was seconds away. The distance between them was 30 feet of horizontal ridge, and the vertical difference between the fixed line and the crest. Seconds that the mountain did not grant. The cornice fractured on a line that ran behind where the overhang visually began, a fundamental characteristic of cornices that every experienced mountaineer understood, and that Niels, standing on the wrong side of that line, did not feel until the snow shifted beneath his feet. The break was clean, sudden, and total. The section of snow he was standing on separated from the ridge and dropped. Niels Decker fell down the Kangshung face of Mount Everest, a near vertical wall of ice and rock that plunged more than 10,000 feet to the glacier below. The fall was not survivable from the first second. There was no ledge to catch him, no slope to slow the acceleration, no feature between the cornice and the glacier that could have changed the outcome. He was gone before the sound of the fracture finished echoing off the ridge. Pemba climbed back up to the fracture point. The broken cornice edge was sharp and clean, a fresh wound in the snow that exposed the layered structure of wind-built overhang and the empty air beneath it. He looked over the edge. The Kangshung face dropped away into cloud and shadow, a vertical void that swallowed everything. There was nothing to see. There was nothing to do. He remained at the edge for a long moment, long enough that the cold began penetrating his gloves and the wind pushed him off balance. Then he turned around and descended. Niels Dekker's body was never recovered. Pemba Tshering descended to Camp 4 and reported the death as a tragic accident, a client who stepped onto a cornice while photographing at the south summit. In the weeks that followed, the climbing community examined Niels' summit history with the scrutiny that death invites and life does not. Experienced climbers identified inconsistencies in his photos, terrain at Broad Peak matching the false summit, Manaslu's ridge angle matching a position below the top, cloud patterns on Cho Oyu consistent with where weather had turned back multiple teams. Former Sherpas from each expedition confirmed what the photos suggested. 3 8,000-meter summits, all fabricated. Pemba sustained no physical injuries. What he carried was the image of looking back and seeing his client on the corniced edge, the shout that didn't reach, the fracture in the seconds between recognition and response. He continues guiding, but he states in interviews that the memory of that broken edge follows him through every season that comes after. The fraud that kept Niels Dekker alive on 3 mountains was the same pattern that killed him on the 4th. He didn't die because he climbed too high. He died because he stopped short and needed the mountain to look like something it wasn't. On Cho Oyu, the clouds hid the truth. On Manaslu, the angle cooperated. On Broad Peak, the false summit did the work. On Everest, the mountain offered no such courtesy. The lie required him to stand where no climber would stand, and the mountain broke beneath him. It was May 22nd, 2017, during one of the busiest spring summit periods on Mount Everest. A short window of lower wind above the South Col drew multiple expeditions onto the route at the same time, packing climbers closely together as they pushed upward. Among the climbers that night were Daniel Kovacs, a 14-year-old from Hungary, and his father, Laszlo Kovacs, a 41-year-old construction supervisor from Budapest. The expedition was framed less as a technical challenge than a personal goal, reaching Everest together before Daniel finished school. Daniel trusted his father's judgment and deferred decisions to him throughout the climb. Daniel trained for over a year and completed all acclimatization rotations on schedule. He showed no signs of altitude sickness and, despite his smaller size, moved steadily at Camp 4. Above 27,000 feet, he remained alert, followed instructions, and maintained his oxygen flow as planned. They were climbing with a budget outfitter during one of the most crowded weeks of the season. The company advertised prices far below competitors, promising the same route, camps and summit chance. Costs were reduced in ways clients could not see on the mountain. One of those cuts involved oxygen. Investigators later confirmed that some cylinders were refilled off the mountain with industrial compressed air instead of medical-grade oxygen. Externally, the tanks appeared normal, correct pressure, standard regulators, full gauges. Once staged along the route, they were indistinguishable from real oxygen bottles. At that altitude, there was no way to verify their contents. During the final traverse below the summit ridge, Daniel's pace slowed. He didn't collapse. He didn't fall. His posture lowered slightly, and his steps became shorter. Guides interpreted this as normal fatigue at extreme altitude, especially in a young climber. A short rest was signaled to prevent further slowdown. Laszlo responded by switching Daniel's cylinder with a fresh bottle from the cache. He checked the pressure gauge before reconnecting the regulator. The needle sat firmly at full. Everything appeared to be working. However, Daniel did not improve. What flowed through the mask contained too little oxygen to support life at that altitude. Industrial compressed air has roughly the same oxygen percentage as normal air at sea level. At nearly 28,000 feet, that concentration is not enough. The system delivered pressure, but not breathable oxygen. Within minutes, Daniel's breathing became erratic, and his body seized while he remained clipped to the fixed rope. Guides increased the flow rate and swapped the cylinder again. The replacement came from the same cache. The seizure ended, but Daniel did not regain consciousness. He remained upright, supported by the rope and harness. His head dropped forward. His chest stopped moving. Climbers backed up along the line. Some waited. Others stepped past as guides made repeated adjustments that had no effect. By the time movement resumed, Daniel was already dead. The official finding listed the cause of death as hypoxic respiratory failure due to insufficient oxygen concentration caused by systematic fraud in the outfitter's oxygen supply. His body remained where it was through the rest of the summit window. No recovery was attempted. Above 27,000 feet on Mount Everest, Exposure, exhaustion, and heavy traffic make retrieval too dangerous, and guides focus on getting surviving climbers down safely. Laszlo was escorted back toward Camp 4 within hours and was physically able to descend. After the expedition, investigators traced the oxygen supply to an off-mountain refill operation. Tests showed several cylinders contained compressed air instead of medical-grade oxygen. The tanks were pressurized correctly, which is why the gauges appeared normal. Records showed the practice was used throughout the season to cut costs. Clients and guides were never informed. The outfitters' permits were revoked, and criminal charges followed. It was April 8, 2017, and Everest Base Camp sat at 17,600 feet on the fractured surface of the Khumbu Glacier, a sprawling tent city wedged between moraines and shifting ice in the shadow of the Khumbu Icefall. Spring had arrived in the Himalaya, and the sun warmed the glacier enough by midday to send meltwater trickling beneath tents. Prayer flags snapped in wind that carried the sharp smell of ice and faint diesel exhaust from the larger mess tents. Above camp, the icefall rose in a chaotic cascade of house-sized seracs and deep crevasses, the route already marked by fixed ropes and aluminum ladders. Beyond that, the western CWM funneled toward the Lhotse face, and above everything, Everest's summit pyramid caught the last light each evening in a way that made the mountain look closer than it was. Roughly 300 climbers occupied base camp across more than 30 expeditions. The season was building toward the narrow summit windows that May would deliver. Among those preparing were the Engstroms, a family of 3 from Boulder, Colorado, who had come to Everest as a unit and intended to summit the same way. Kurt Engstrom was 52, a semi-retired tech executive who had sold his software company 5 years earlier and redirected his energy toward mountaineering. He had summited Denali, Elbrus, and Kilimanjaro over the previous decade, funding his children's climbing development alongside his own. The Everest expedition was his design, a legacy project, the defining achievement the 3 of them would share. He had selected the operator and paid the $55,000 per person fee, covering permits, Sherpa support, oxygen, and the infrastructure required to move a family up the world's tallest mountain. Jonas Engstrom was 27, the older of Kurt's 2 children, and the most naturally gifted climber in the family. He had summited Denali and Aconcagua alongside his sister and completed a guided Amadablam climb on his own, a technical ascent that required skills beyond what the family's shared expeditions had demanded. He was steady, efficient, and quietly risk-aware in ways that sometimes put him at odds with the family's momentum. But Jonas's loyalty to the unit overrode his individual judgment, with a consistency that had never been tested at extreme altitude. Mara Engstrom was 23, the youngest, and the one who needed Everest most. She had summited Denali and Aconcagua on the same expeditions as Jonas, but where Jonas climbed with natural ease, Mara climbed with visible effort and fierce determination that she framed as mental toughness. She was fit, driven, and deeply competitive, particularly with Jonas, whose effortless ability at altitude reminded her constantly of the gap between talent and will. Mara had completed a basic mountaineering course on Rainier, learning crampon technique and rope travel, but her technical foundation remained thinner than her ambition suggested. She documented every climb meticulously, not as an influencer chasing followers, but as someone assembling proof that she belonged, that the achievements were hers and not simply the product of her father's funding. The pattern of self-curation ran deeper than documentation. During previous expeditions, she had developed a habit of editing her own narrative, downplaying struggles, inflating ease, presenting a version of herself that performed better than reality. It was reflexive rather than calculated, the kind of subtle dishonesty that worked in low-stakes environments and became lethal when the stakes changed. The family's primary guide was Lakpa Nuru, 38, from Tame Village, a veteran of 14 years with 9 Everest summits. He was known among operators as calm under pressure, technically precise, and perceptive with clients in ways that went beyond route finding. He supported a wife and 4 children, his eldest daughter recently accepted to a boarding school in Kathmandu, whose fees would consume most of what the season earned him. An assistant Sherpa, younger, competent with load carries and camp logistics, rounded out the support team. Lakpa Nuru began reading the angstroms during the first week. Kurt was easy to understand, motivated, methodical, trusting. He asked thoughtful questions during the expedition, briefing and deferred to the guide's experience with genuine openness. Jonas was similarly straightforward, quiet, capable, the kind of client who required minimal management. Mara was different. During the same briefing, she focused on timing, when the summit window would open, how the rotation schedule mapped to summit day, how quickly teams moved through the upper camps. Her questions oriented toward the destination rather than the process, a pattern Lakpa Nuru had seen in clients who treated the mountain as an obstacle, an achievement rather than an environment demanding adaptation. Many ambitious climbers arrived with the same orientation and adjusted once the altitude imposed its lessons. The first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet through the Khumbu Icefall confirmed what Lakpa Nuru suspected about the family's internal dynamics. Mara climbed fast, faster than the group's pace required, pulling ahead on the fixed lines, arriving at Camp 1 well before Kurt and Jonas. Her speed was genuine, but Lakpa Nuru noticed what arrival times concealed. At camp, Mara's recovery took longer than it should have for someone who appeared strong on the move. Her breathing remained elevated well after she stopped climbing, and her appetite was suppressed in ways that suggested her body was paying a higher cost than her pace advertised. Kurt arrived later, steady and satisfied. Jonas arrived shortly after his father, having matched Kurt's pace out of loyalty rather than necessity. That evening, when the family gathered in their tent, Mara described the icefall crossing to Kurt in terms that Lakpa Nuru recognized as edited. She emphasized the sections she had moved through quickly and omitted the moments where her breathing had been ragged and her rest stops had stretched longer than efficient climbing allowed. Jonas was present for the conversation. His expression suggested he had observed the same climb Lakpa Nuru had. The pattern repeated through the second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet, and the third to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. Mara pushed ahead each time, arrived first, and presented the effort to Kurt as confirmation her preparation was working. The reality was more complicated. Her speed came at a cost that accumulated. Deeper fatigue, slower recovery, a persistent dry cough that appeared after Camp 3 and lingered through rest days. Lakpa Nuru recognized the cough as common at altitude, but monitored it closely because the line between irritation and early pulmonary edema was difficult to distinguish without imaging. Kurt's performance showed the limitations age imposed at extreme altitude. He was slower than both children, required longer recovery, and his oxygen saturation at Camp 3 read 72%, workable but trending in a direction that left less margin than younger climbers carried. Jonas performed well at every stage, his body adapting efficiently. Lakpa Nuru raised his observations with the expedition leader privately. His concern was not qualification, the family was better prepared than many clients, but that the internal dynamics created a specific vulnerability. The expedition leader acknowledged the concern and noted the family had signed standard waivers. Absent clear medical disqualification, the climb would proceed. The weather window opened on May 18th. The push from base camp to Camp 4 took 2 days with overnight stops at Camp 2 and Camp 3. The family climbed together, their pace dictated by Kurt's rhythm. At Camp 3, Mara was restless, eager to push higher while Kurt and Jonas rested. Her cough had not improved, and Lakpa Nuru noted a subtle wheeze he could not definitively attribute to anything more than altitude irritation. He mentioned it to Mara, who dismissed it and pointed out that half the climbers on the mountain were coughing. They reached Camp 4 on the South Col at approximately 26,000 feet on the afternoon of May 20th. The South Col was a desolate shelf of wind-blasted rock and ice, tents anchored against gusts that swept across the col with unpredictable violence. The air at 26,000 feet contained roughly 40% of the oxygen available at sea level, and every movement required deliberate effort that felt disproportionate to the task. Lakpa Nuru checked the family. Kurt's saturation with supplemental flow read in the high 60s, marginal but consistent with his trajectory. Jonas read in the low 70s, solid. Mara's reading was 70, accompanied by the persistent cough and a fatigue her forced energy couldn't fully conceal. All three fell within the range where the summit push would proceed. None guaranteed success. The summit push departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 20th. Clear night, stars dense overhead, wind manageable, temperature near minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Other teams departed in the same window, headlamps forming a broken chain of light ascending toward the southeast ridge. The family started together, Lakpa Nuru in front, Kurt and Jonas behind, Mara behind them, the assistant at the rear. The formation held for the first hour, then Mara's pace began to separate. She moved faster on the fixed ropes, passing her father and brother in the darkness with the driven efficiency that characterized every rotation. Lakpa Nuru radioed her to slow down. She acknowledged, but did not adjust. By the balcony at approximately 27,600 feet, the gap had become a problem. Mara was roughly 20 minutes ahead, climbing steadily while the family maintained their pace below. Lakpa Nuru faced the decision, the situation forced. Let Mara continue solo above 27,600 feet, a scenario that violated every principle of high-altitude guiding, or go after her and leave Kurt and Jonas with the assistant. He assessed the information available. Kurt and Jonas were moving steadily, coherent, on oxygen, the assistant competent with the fixed systems. The route above was established and crowded with other teams. Mara alone above 27,600 feet in darkness was the more immediate danger. Lakpa Nuru instructed the assistant to maintain pace with Kurt and Jonas and pushed upward to close the gap. He caught Mara above the balcony and they continued together up the southeast ridge. Kurt reported steady progress. Jonas confirmed they were moving well. The assistant relayed that both men were functional and on pace. Nothing in the transmission suggested the decision to split had created danger. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. The route above the balcony steepened through rocky mixed terrain before reaching the south summit at approximately 28,700 feet. Mara and Lakpa Nuru arrived around 5:15 a.m., dawn light beginning to reveal the final ridge stretching toward the summit. From the south summit, the route traversed a knife-edge ridge of corniced snow before dropping to a notch and climbing the Hillary Step, a near vertical rock and ice face roughly 40 feet tall before the final summit slope. Conditions had been holding, but as Mara and Lakpa Nuru assessed the ridge ahead, the wind began to shift. What had been manageable gusts from the northwest strengthened and changed direction, pushing spindrift across the exposed ridge in sheets that reduced visibility and bit through every gap in layered clothing. Cloud was building to the west, visible in the growing light as a thickening gray band that hadn't been there an hour earlier. The weather window, which forecasts had promised for 48 hours, was showing signs of narrowing ahead of schedule. Lakpa Nuru recommended turning around. The wind trend was worsening. The cloud buildup suggested incoming weather, and continuing along the exposed ridge toward the Hillary Step in deteriorating conditions increased risk dramatically. Mara was roughly 330 vertical feet from the summit, close enough to taste, far enough that the terrain between here and there was among the most exposed and technical on the entire route. Mara resisted. She had climbed for 18 hours to reach this point. The summit was right there. She pushed forward along the ridge toward the Hillary Step, and Lakpa Nuru followed, because letting her continue alone was not an option. They made it partway along the traverse before Mara's condition and the weather converged into a wall she could not push through. Her cough had worsened significantly. Each bout now doubled her over and left her gasping for air that the altitude couldn't provide in sufficient quantity. The wind made the exposed ridge treacherous, and her pace had slowed to the point where reaching the summit and descending safely was no longer realistic. Lakpa Nuru insisted again, and this time the mountain reinforced his words. Mara turned around near the Hillary Step, approximately 200 vertical feet below the summit. The descent from the south summit area back along the ridge was difficult but controlled. And then Mara made the radio call that would end 2 lives. Kurt and Jonas were below them, approaching the south summit from the balcony. when Kurt's voice came through their radio asking how conditions were above. Mara responded with the calm, practiced ease of someone who had been curating her own narrative for years. She told them she had summited. The words came out without hesitation, not shouted, not dramatized, just stated as fact. She added that conditions were manageable, that the route was clear, that they should keep pushing. Lakpanuru was several paces ahead on the fixed line and did not hear the full transmission over the wind. Kurt's response was immediate and audible even through the static. Pride, emotion, elation that his daughter had stood on top of the world. The conversation was brief because altitude made every word expensive, but the information it delivered was catastrophic. Mara had summited, which meant conditions allowed it. The turnaround time was approaching, but if Mara had made it, the summit was reachable. Everything the lie communicated told Kurt and Jonas to continue. If Mara had told the truth, that she had turned around 200 feet short because conditions were deteriorating, her body was failing, and Lakpanuru had called it, Kurt and Jonas would have descended. The information that the strongest, fastest member of their family couldn't reach the top would have been the clearest possible signal that continuing was dangerous. They pushed past the turnaround time into conditions that Mara's honesty would have prevented them from entering. Minutes later, Mara and Lakpanuru descended past Kurt and Jonas on the southeast ridge. The encounter was brief. At extreme altitude above 28,000 feet, conversation cost energy that no one could spare. They saw each other. Kurt raised a hand. Mara nodded. The brevity of the exchange protected the lie. There was no time for questions about conditions, no opportunity for details that might have unraveled. Mara going down was entirely consistent with having summited. Lakpanuru, focused on managing the descent and unaware of what Mara had transmitted, did not intervene. Kurt and Jonas continued upward with the assistant Sherpa into conditions that were no longer what Mara had described. The wind had strengthened considerably since her turnaround, and the cloud bank to the west was advancing faster than the morning forecast had suggested. Visibility on the upper ridge was deteriorating from hundreds of feet to dozens, and the temperature was dropping as the wind chill intensified. Kurt began showing signs of distress above the south summit. His pace, already the slowest in the family, dropped to a crawl, 10 steps, then a rest stop that stretched into minutes. His movements on the fixed rope became clumsy, his hands fumbling transitions that should have been automatic. The assistant Sherpa recognized the pattern and urged immediate descent. They were past the turnaround time. Conditions were worsening by the minute, and Kurt's deterioration matched the early progression of high-altitude cerebral edema. Jonas wanted to turn around. His instincts, which had been overridden by family loyalty at every previous decision point, were screaming at him to descend. But Kurt refused. Mara had summited. His 23-year-old daughter had stood on top of Everest, and he would not be the one who turned back. Jonas looked at his father, looked at the ridge above them, disappearing into blowing snow, and deferred the way he always had. Above 28,800 feet, Kurt could no longer continue. The haze had progressed past the point where determination could compensate, and his eyes carried the unfocused distance that signaled his brain was swelling faster than supplemental oxygen could counteract. Jonas and the assistant Sherpa began the descent, with a man who could not participate in his own survival. Kurt's weight sagged against the fixed rope and against Jonas, who bore the physical burden of keeping his father moving while the storm closed in around them. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The wind chill pushed past minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin froze within minutes. The assistant Sherpa worked the anchor transitions while Jonas managed Kurt's body, guiding his father's boots into footsteps that Kurt could no longer find on his own. Kurt lost consciousness on the southeast ridge sometime around 9 a.m. The assistant Sherpa assessed the situation with the clarity that survival demanded. 2 men were now incapacitated, or nearly so. The storm was intensifying, and staying on the ridge meant 3 deaths instead of 2. He could not carry Kurt alone. He could not carry both. Descending to Camp 4 to get help was the only option that preserved any chance of rescue, even though every minute of descent was a minute that Kurt and Jonas spent dying on the ridge. He made the correct decision under impossible circumstances and began the descent alone. Jonas stayed with his father. The storm buried them in spindrift and wind that erased the world beyond arm's reach. Meanwhile, Mara reached Camp 4 safely with Lakpanuru in the late morning. The descent from the south summit had been difficult but uneventful, and both arrived exhausted but functional. Then the waiting began. Hours passed with no radio contact from above. When the assistant Sherpa arrived at Camp 4 alone, the situation became clear. Lakpanuru listened to the report. Both men somewhere on the southeast ridge above 28,000 feet, in a storm that was still building. Without hesitation, Lakpanuru prepared to go back up. The rescue attempt was desperate by any measure. Lakpanuru had already descended from nearly 29,000 feet that same day. His body had been above 26,000 feet for more than 18 hours. He reached approximately 27,000 feet before the mountain stopped him. The wind was too strong. The visibility was zero. His own body was failing. Muscles that had carried him up 9 previous Everest summits could not produce what the situation demanded after the day he had already endured. Continuing higher meant adding his own death to the count without any realistic chance of reaching Kurt and Jonas. He turned around. During the descent back to Camp 4, navigating iced rock in near whiteout conditions, Lakpanuru's crampon caught and he fell. The impact fractured his left ankle and tore ligaments in his right knee, injuries that sent pain through both legs with every subsequent step. He made it back to Camp 4 on adrenaline, arriving in a condition that required immediate assistance. When conditions cleared the following day, a Sherpa team pushed up the southeast ridge. They found Kurt Engstrom first, motionless on the fixed line, his body positioned where consciousness had left him. Jonas was found nearby, slumped against the slope within arm's reach of his father, dead from hypothermia and HACE progression. He had never moved from his father's side. The lie unraveled almost immediately. Lakpanuru had been beside Mara when she turned around. Radio timestamps placed her turnaround well before a summit would have required. Kurt and Jonas had pushed past the turnaround, past the weather window, and past the limits of their physiology based on information that was false. Mara's claim told them conditions were manageable and the top was reachable. Neither was true. The decision to continue, Kurt's insistence, Jonas's deference, was built on a foundation that didn't exist. Lakpanuru's ankle and knee required surgery in Kathmandu. The fracture healed imperfectly, and the ligament damage left his knee unstable under loads that high-altitude guiding demanded. The physical limitations ended his career above 8,000 meters, but the injury that followed him furthest had no surgical remedy. The knowledge that he had been beside Mara when she made the call, that the wind had carried her words away from him, that by the time he understood what happened, 2 men were already dying on a ridge he couldn't reach. Mara Engstrom descended from Camp 4 under her own power, physically intact. She had lied about the summit, and the lie had sent her father and her brother into conditions that killed them both. It was June 6th, 2017, during a short break in the weather on Mount Everest, when climbers began moving again through the upper Khumbu icefall. Visibility improved enough for teams to space themselves out along the fixed route. The ropes were already in place, drilled into blue ice and frozen blocks that had held steady for years. And along that route were frozen bodies. They were never spoken about directly, but everyone on the mountain knew where they were. Preserved by cold rather than decay, the bodies remained visible for years, gradually becoming fixed reference points along the route. In a landscape that constantly shifts, they stayed in roughly the same place, used quietly by guides to mark position and progress. Moving through the area that morning was Lucas Brenner, a 31-year-old freelance videographer from Munich. He had high-altitude experience and full permits for Everest, but no guided slot that ensured a clear summit image. On summit day, he climbed independently, deliberately spacing himself from groups so his footage would appear solitary. Lucas wasn't just filming the climb. He wanted images that looked higher than where he actually was. On Everest, location is often judged by what's missing. No ropes, no crowds, familiar reference points pushed out of frame. A single photo, framed carefully, can suggest a summit or near-summit moment, even when it isn't. Bodies along the route had become part of the visual landscape. Unmoved for years, they were treated like fixed terrain. One lay just off the main line, partly encased in ice and assumed to be stable. Lucas stopped there and framed a shot that placed him alone against the slope, the body blurred in the background. By excluding the rope and nearby climbers, the image suggested isolation rather than congestion. To clean the frame further, he pulled lightly at the body's shoulder to move the rope out of view. It shifted more easily than expected, then settled. He took the photo and continued upward. Hours later, on descent, he returned for another image. The light was better. This time the body was no longer stable. The earlier adjustment had broken the thin bond holding it in place. When he touched it again, the body shifted and began to slide. Unseen beneath the surface, it had never been anchored to rock, only held by ice pressure and friction. Once disturbed, there was nothing left to stop its movement. As Lucas clipped in and leaned back to adjust his position, the fixed rope took load. The rope slid against the body, which now acted as a loose mass instead of a fixed object. The ice beneath them fractured with a low tearing sound. They began to slide. At first, there was no drop, just sudden movement. Lucas's crampons scraped, failed to bite, then skipped completely. The rope pulled tight, then tore free from its shallow anchor as both bodies crossed the edge of the slope. Lucas was pulled first, dragged sideways into the broken terrain between ice blocks. He struck hard ice and disappeared into a crevasse. The body followed, tumbling without resistance. The rope fed through until it jammed and locked below the surface. No climber was positioned close enough to intervene, and the terrain made any immediate response unsafe. In the Khumbu icefall, once someone is pulled into a crevasse, access is limited by overhanging ice, unstable blocks, and constant internal movement. Even rapid response in that zone carries a high risk of secondary collapse. After Lucas Brenner failed to arrive at the next staging point, guides initiated standard missing climber procedures. Radio checks were made up and down the route. Nearby teams were asked if they had seen him pass. Fixed line segments were visually inspected from safe positions, but no one could approach the crevasse without putting additional lives at risk. Within hours, drifting snow and refreezing meltwater began to narrow the opening where the fall occurred. By the following day, normal glacier movement had already altered the area. A short section of fixed rope remained visible before disappearing into the ice, indicating where the fall had occurred, but the crevasse itself could not be safely accessed. Over the next several days, teams passing through the icefall reported seeing the rope frozen into the glacier at a steep downward angle. In clear light, two shapes could be seen beneath the surface, pressed together by refrozen ice. Any attempt to descend would have required cutting into unstable ice blocks directly beneath hanging seracs, a risk deemed unacceptable. No recovery was attempted. The incident was reviewed by expedition operators and Nepalese authorities once the route was closed. The investigation concluded that the failure resulted from direct human interaction with an object mistakenly treated as fixed terrain, destabilizing both the body and the anchor system. Afterward, guides quietly adjusted route descriptions and briefings. The location was no longer referenced by a body or landmark, but by a rope disappearing into the glacier, a practical marker in an environment where nothing remains stable for long. It was May 14th, 2023, 6:47 a.m. Nepal Standard Time on Mount Everest's South Col route at 26,200 feet. Winds ran 15 to 20 miles per hour from the southwest. The temperature was negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill near negative 35. Visibility stretched more than 2 miles. Standard summit window conditions, what teams call go weather. Leonardo Martinez, 29, stood at the South Col, ready to chase a speed record that had lasted 19 years. He carried stripped down gear and a vial of stimulants that would stop his heart 1,150 feet below the summit. Leo was a fitness influencer and guide from Boulder, Colorado. He had climbed Denali, Aconcagua, and Cho Oyu and built an audience of nearly 850,000 followers. He tried Everest once before in 2021 but turned back at 25,200 feet due to the weather. At 5 feet, 10 inches and 165 pounds, he trained hard. Altitude simulations, ice routes, long endurance sessions, sharing every metric online as his Everest push played out in public. The goal for the climb was simple: break the 10-hour, 56-minute speed record from base camp to the summit, set by Pemba Dorje Sherpa in 2004. The 19-year record he was chasing was more than a time. It was set by a Sherpa climber, shaped by a lifetime at altitude, and speed records on Everest are rarely broken by non-Sherpas. From the South Col, most climbers need 8 to 12 hours just to reach the summit. A record attempt compresses that into a near-limit effort above 26,000 feet, where every pound of gear, every stop, and every breath of oxygen matters. At that height, small mistakes grow quickly, and there is almost no room to recover. This was his second attempt. In 2021, he had turned back at 25,200 feet due to the weather. Since then, his public profile had grown, and his training metrics were shared widely as proof he was ready. A standard summit would not change much. A record would. To beat it, he would need constant forward movement with no reserve and no hesitation. That pressure followed him above the South Col and narrowed his options as he climbed. Normal expedition rules require emergency bivouac gear, backup oxygen, and climbing in guided groups of 4 to 6 with Sherpa support. Martinez chose a solo-style push with one Sherpa, Pemba Tashi, a 12-time Everest summiter. Pemba raised concerns at base camp. Speed records are usually set by Sherpas with lifelong altitude exposure and decades of experience. Martinez relied instead on his fitness data and high VO2 max scores. The South Col route used fixed ropes installed earlier in the season. The ropes were anchored into snow and ice every 75 to 100 feet and designed for steady, controlled climbing, one person per section, moving at a measured pace. They were strong, rated for heavy loads, but those ratings assumed gradual movement. Speed climbing changes the stress pattern. Instead of short bursts with rest, it creates constant tension, less recovery time, and more sudden force from fast movements. Weather data on May 13th showed a stable high-pressure system. The jet stream sat well above the summit, giving a predicted 6 to 8 hour calm window starting around 5:30 a.m. No storms were approaching. On paper, conditions looked solid, but medical records from previous seasons showed a pattern. Rapid ascents between 24,000 and 26,000 feet had led to multiple cases of high-altitude pulmonary edema. Speed reduces acclimatization time and forces the heart and lungs to work at maximum output for longer periods. Expedition doctors had recommended strict oxygen saturation checks and minimum cutoffs before continuing higher. Martinez's plan left little margin if his body failed to keep up. At 5:15 a.m., Leonardo's oxygen saturation went 67%. At the South Col base, camp medical officer logged. His heart rate and breathing showed increasing strain. The usual minimum for a summit push was 75%. Team members nearby heard him reply that his numbers always ran low and that he felt fine. He checked his gear, adjusted the chest camera, and set his oxygen to 3 liters per minute. His watch showed a heart rate of 92. 2 climbers in a nearby tent later said he moved quickly and skipped the usual long rest most teams take before departure. One noted that his pack looked noticeably lighter than standard summit loads. Pemba Tashi finished his own checks beside him, carrying extra oxygen, an emergency bivvy, and spare layers. Gear Leonardo had chosen not to bring. Other Sherpas at the South Col observed the difference in load and said Pemba was carrying what would normally be split between 2 climbers. With the added weight, it was clear he would not be able to match Leonardo's planned pace once they left camp. Martinez left the South Col climbing much faster than normal. He moved at about 850 vertical feet per hour, while the typical pace was closer to 600. At that altitude, the difference meant more strain on his heart and lungs with every step. During a radio check, Pemba Tashi reported to the base camp medical officer that Martinez was already pulling ahead. At that speed, he would lose visual contact within half an hour. The update was logged, and hourly condition reports were requested. The slope above the South Col was angled between 30 and 40 degrees. Steep snow, but not technical. Fixed ropes ran the entire section. Climbers clipped in, kicked their crampons into the snow, and pulled themselves up with ascenders. Martinez moved smoothly. Step, breathe, slide the device. Step again. His breathing averaged about 22 breaths per minute, slightly higher than the usual 16 to 20 at that effort level, but still controlled. By 6:15 a.m., other climbers noticed his breathing had changed. What had been slow and steady turned fast and shallow, about 28 breaths a minute. The audio from his chest camera picked up a dry cough starting around 26,450 feet. It came every 45 seconds or so, short and sharp, like irritation from cold, dry air. Audio from the chest-mounted camera captured him, attributing the cough to altitude and dry air. The video showed his gloved hand sliding up the fixed rope, crampons biting into blue ice, and the long white slope rising toward the south summit. At 26,600 feet, he stopped for about a minute and a half to adjust his oxygen mask. The gauge showed normal flow, but he said he felt short of breath. He turned the flow up to 3.5 liters per minute, higher than standard. Within moments, his breathing slowed slightly, and he continued climbing. Pembatashi, about 200 feet below, radioed base camp to report the change and his concern about how long the oxygen would last at that rate. At the higher flow, his supply would drop from roughly 6 hours to about 4.5, leaving almost no margin for delay. At 6:32 a.m., Leonardo stopped and pulled off his outer down parka. The jacket was rated for -40 degrees and weighed about 2.5 pounds. He stuffed it into the outside pocket of his pack, leaving himself in a mid-weight layer and a shell. The temperature at that height was around -22 degrees. Standard practice above 26,000 feet calls for at least 3 layers in case you have to stop or get delayed. Pembatashi saw him remove it and warned him over the radio not to. Leonardo said he was overheating and would put it back on if he got cold. After that, he moved faster. With less weight and more freedom to move, he climbed at a stronger pace. His body heat kept him warm while he stayed in motion. Footage from his camera would later show sweat on his face despite the cold. His fitness tracker briefly showed a heart rate of 158 beats per minute, well above the usual 120 to 140 range for steady climbing at that altitude. It meant he was pushing much harder than most climbers could sustain for long. By 6:58 a.m., Leonardo picked up speed. He was climbing about 920 vertical feet per hour and had already gained 1,100 feet in just over an hour, fast enough to beat the record by more than an hour. His tracker showed a steady heart rate of 165 beats per minute, close to his limit. Even with oxygen flowing at 3 liters per minute, he was breathing around 30 times a minute. Over the radio, he reported feeling strong. His heart rate and breathing showed increasing strain. His body was working harder than the oxygen supply could support. At 27,000 feet, he passed 2 climbers from a commercial team who were resting on the fixed line. One climber later described his pace as unusually fast for that altitude. They didn't see obvious distress, but both noticed his breathing was heavy and his steps slightly uneven. Small signs of low oxygen that are hard to recognize in yourself at that altitude. Around 7:23 a.m., the strain began to show on the rope section between 26,800 and 26,950 feet. Climbers behind him later said the line looked stretched and tight as he moved quickly upward. The rope had already carried hundreds of climbers that season. One anchor picket near 26,875 feet had shifted slightly in the snow, leaving a small gap at the surface. As the rope stretched under tension, it became harder to pull upward. Instead of slowing down, Leonardo pulled harder. That pushed his heart rate and oxygen use even higher. His ascender, the metal cam that grips the rope, was built for heavy force, but his fast, powerful movements kept it near the upper end of its normal range. By 7:41 a.m., his breathing had changed. He was coughing every 15 to 20 seconds. The sound picked up on his chest camera was wet and heavy, the kind doctors link to fluid building up in the lungs. At extreme altitude, low air pressure can force fluid out of the lungs' tiny blood vessels and into the air sacs. That condition, high-altitude pulmonary edema, makes it harder and harder to move oxygen into the blood. It often starts with a steady cough and shortness of breath, then gets worse. Leonardo kept streaming and told viewers he was just pushing through it, blaming the cough on cold air. About 300 feet below, Pembatashi radioed base camp and reported that Leonardo's breathing sounded abnormal. The medical officer on duty instructed him to stop and check his oxygen saturation. At 27,150 feet, he clipped a pulse oximeter to his finger. The device hesitated in the cold before displaying a reading of 58%. At 27,150 feet, a saturation reading of 58% placed him below the level most expeditions consider safe for continued ascent. Even with supplemental oxygen flowing at 3 to 4 liters per minute, climbers typically aim to maintain readings above 75% during a summit push. Below 65%, cognitive performance begins to decline measurably. Reaction time slows. Fine motor coordination becomes inconsistent. Decision-making narrows toward short-term goals. Medical protocols used by many commercial operators treat a reading below 70% as a mandatory descent trigger. Guides are trained to watch for additional symptoms: persistent cough, imbalance, delayed responses, and abnormal breathing patterns. At 58%, the body is operating under a significant oxygen deficit. The brain receives less oxygen per heartbeat, and the heart must compensate by increasing rate and force to maintain circulation. From that position on the South Col route, descent to the high camp would typically take 45 to 60 minutes under stable conditions. With oxygen flow increased and pace reduced, blood oxygen levels can stabilize during descent. Early-stage high-altitude pulmonary edema can improve if addressed quickly. The window for reversal narrows as fluid accumulation increases, but at that moment, retreat remained physically possible. The terrain below was fixed and familiar. Weather conditions were still stable. Oxygen supply, though reduced by the higher flow rate, remained sufficient for descent. The medical advisory to turn around was logged. The option to reverse course still existed. Instead of initiating descent, he resumed climbing. Within minutes, his heart rate climbed further. The oxygen deficit remained unresolved. At extreme altitude, sustained exertion under those conditions increases strain on the pulmonary arteries, thickens blood viscosity from dehydration, and elevates cardiac workload. Continuing upward shifted the physiological balance from marginal to unstable. The final margin for correction closed above that point. At sea level, normal oxygen saturation is 95 to 100%. At 27,000 feet without oxygen, it's often 60 to 70%, with oxygen flowing at 3 to 4 liters per minute. Most climbers expect 75 to 85%. A reading of 58% meant his body wasn't getting enough oxygen, even with the tank running. Several climbers at the South Col heard the exchange over the shared radio channel. One teammate later said Leonardo's voice sounded steady but rushed, as if he wanted to end the call quickly. Another recalled him pulling off a glove, rubbing his fingers, and repeating that the reading was wrong because his hands were cold. The expedition medical officer advised him to turn around and descend. Leonardo reported that he felt fine and was less than 700 vertical feet from the south summit, and said he would reassess. Low oxygen can impair judgment, especially at extreme altitude. The medical team logged the exchange and documented that he continued upward against medical advice. Under expedition rules, the final decision remained with the climber, but the warning was formally recorded. Dextroamphetamine and modafinil are stimulants. They raise heart rate and blood pressure, increase alertness, and dull fatigue. Both are banned in competitive sports and can strain the heart, especially at extreme altitude, where the body is already under stress. Toxicology later showed Leonardo had taken about 3 times the normal medical dose. Within 4 minutes, his heart rate climbed from 165 to 187 beats per minute. His breathing sped up to 35 breaths per minute, even though his oxygen flow stayed the same. Witnesses behind him said his pace suddenly changed. He moved faster, pulling hard on the rope and placing his crampons quickly. Camera footage showed him talking rapidly, saying he felt amazing and that the record would fall that day. Within minutes, his heart rate increased from 165 to 187 beats per minute. At that altitude, stimulant-induced heart acceleration combined with severe oxygen deprivation. The stimulants pushed his heart rate higher than it could handle. He was already showing signs of high-altitude pulmonary edema, which meant fluid in his lungs was blocking oxygen transfer. Even with bottled oxygen, his body wasn't getting enough. After 2 hours of climbing at a fast pace, his heart was working near its limit. His oxygen saturation, already down to 58%, kept falling as his body used oxygen faster than his lungs could supply it. At 8:07 a.m., the fixed rope above 27,200 feet came under heavy strain. As his movements grew more forceful, the rope stretched under repeated force, increasing tension on the upper anchor. The main anchor, an aluminum picket buried in hard snow, began to shift. Over about 30 seconds, climbers later reported the anchor appeared to have shifted slightly in the snow, leaving a small gap at the surface. It didn't pull out, but the snow was starting to give. If it failed, the force would drop to the next anchor at 75 feet below, risking a chain reaction down the line. By 8:14 a.m., Martinez reached about 27,350 feet, roughly 650 feet below the south summit. The slope steepened to around 45 degrees, forcing him to kick harder with his crampons and lean more on the fixed rope to pull himself up. Later investigation reports documented that his breathing had become fast and shallow. Pink foam was noted around his mouth and nose, consistent with advanced high-altitude pulmonary edema. His respirations were described as wet and labored. Data recovered from his fitness tracker showed his heart rate remained above 185 beats per minute for more than 12 minutes. An extreme cardiovascular load at 27,000 feet. Review of climber accounts and movement patterns indicated declining coordination. He required multiple kicks to set his crampons and showed irregular pulls on the fixed rope. At 8:16 a.m., he stopped mid-step with his right hand gripping the rope and his left pressed against his chest. Tracker data later showed rapid fluctuations: 187, 191, 178, 195, then 183. 183 beats per minute within seconds, consistent with an unstable heart rhythm. He then resumed climbing, but with sharper, hurried movements. His breathing sounded strained through the mic, far different from earlier in the ascent. At that altitude, the heart is already under extreme stress from low oxygen, dehydration, and sustained effort. The added stimulants pushed it further. His heart rate had stayed high for too long, and the rhythm began to fail, each beat pumping less blood than the last. Before you see what he did at 27,000 feet, and how quickly it unraveled once his body hit its limit. Make sure you're subscribed. The moment you're about to watch is where everything changes. At 8:18 a.m., Leonardo's heart rate spiked to 203 beats per minute, beyond his predicted maximum, then suddenly dropped to 89 as the rhythm became unstable. Later, medical review determined the pattern was consistent with ventricular fibrillation, a lethal arrhythmia in which the heart can no longer pump blood effectively. Without circulation, consciousness fades within seconds. Later analysis pointed to a combination of stimulant strain, severe oxygen deprivation, and extreme physical stress converging at once. At 8:18:34, he stopped mid-step, facing uphill with both hands gripping the fixed rope and crampons set into 35-degree ice. Climbers behind him saw him go still. For about 20 seconds, he did not move. His breathing shifted from rapid and forceful, uneven gasps with long pauses. His tracker showed his heart rate falling quickly, 89, then 76, then 54, then 38 beats per minute in less than half a minute. Witnesses said his body slumped forward while his hands remained clamped to the rope, likely locked by muscle spasm as his heart failed. At 8:19 a.m., he went into full cardiac arrest. His body stiffened briefly, then went limp, still clipped to the fixed rope by his harness and ascender. His full weight, about 183 pounds with gear, shifted onto the rope at once. Climbers below felt the jolt. The rope stretched under the sudden load, and the anchor above shifted slightly in the snow and ice, but it held. On the rope, his head dropped forward. On the rope, his head dropped forward, chin to chest. His crampons still touched the ice, but could not hold his full weight. The fixed rope kept him from falling. He would remain in that position for the next 16 hours until a recovery team reached him. At 8:19 a.m., pink foamy fluid came from his mouth and nose. It was consistent with fluid buildup in the lungs seen in high-altitude pulmonary edema. In the -24-degree air, it froze quickly around his face. His oxygen mask had slipped to the side, but the regulator was still running at 3.5 liters per minute, feeding oxygen into the open air. At 8:19:45 a.m., Pembatashi, about 180 feet below, noticed Leonardo had stopped moving. He radioed base camp to report it and began climbing up to check on him. Moving quickly but staying clipped to the fixed line, he placed each crampon carefully and slid his ascender up the rope. It took him about 8 minutes to cover the 180 feet. At 8:22 a.m., Pembatashi climbed up to Leonardo's body, hanging from the fixed rope. Climbers below saw him steady the body as it swung in the wind. He called out, shook his shoulder, and checked for a pulse. There was none. The temperature was about -24 degrees, and the rope rocked in steady gusts. He radioed base camp at 8:24 a.m., confirmed no breathing and no pulse, and gave the GPS position at 27,350 feet. Resuscitation was not possible at that altitude. When he tried to lower the body, he found the ascender locked tight under full weight. He could not lift him alone. The rope ran 150 feet to the upper anchor and 75 feet to the lower one. The upper anchor had already shifted in the snow. If it failed, both sections could pull loose. He secured himself and waited. By 8:35 a.m., winds increased and snow cut visibility. Other climbers reported the scene over the radio as the news spread through camp. A 4-man recovery team left at 9:30 a.m., but strong gusts forced them to turn back below 27,000 feet. A storm shut the mountain down for 36 hours. 2 days later, a 6-man team reached him in calmer weather. He was frozen in place, the upper anchor still holding. They built new anchors, freed him with pulleys and a powered winch, and lowered him safely. By May 17th, his body reached base camp. A medical exam noted pink foam around his mouth and nose, consistent with high-altitude pulmonary edema. His gear, including the chest camera, was logged for return to his family. After his body was brought down and his equipment cataloged, investigators reviewed the footage stored on his chest-mounted camera. At 7:52 a.m., at approximately 27,100 feet, the video showed Martinez stopping and removing a small vial from an inner jacket pocket. He briefly removed his oxygen mask, consumed the liquid, replaced replaced the mask and resumed climbing. The substance had not been disclosed in expedition medical documentation. Toxicology later confirmed it contained dextroamphetamine and modafinil. An autopsy in Kathmandu confirmed the cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest caused by ventricular fibrillation. Toxicology tests found high levels of dextroamphetamine and modafinil in his blood, amounts consistent with deliberate performance use. His climbing gear showed no defects. Everything functioned as designed. Weather records confirmed temperatures around -24 degrees Fahrenheit with light to moderate wind. Lung tissue showed severe fluid buildup, consistent with high-altitude pulmonary edema from rapid ascent. His heart showed no structural disease, confirming the fatal event was triggered by drug-induced rhythm failure rather than a hidden medical condition. The investigation found gaps in pre-expedition screening. His low oxygen reading that morning, 67% when 75 was the recommended minimum, was documented but not enforced. Witnesses later reported early breathing trouble higher on the route. His pace also exceeded what doctors consider safe at that altitude. Possible safeguards discussed afterward included drug testing for speed attempts, stricter medical authority to stop climbs when vital signs drop, and firm gear requirements regardless of record goals. Still, investigators concluded that he had concealed the stimulant use on purpose, and the heart rhythm collapse happened quickly. The altitude and weather made immediate rescue impossible. No member of the expedition team reported prior knowledge of the vial. Footage was the first documented proof of its use during the climb. Months later, Nepal introduced new rules for speed record attempts, adding drug screening and stricter medical oversight above 26,000 feet. Expedition companies tightened gear requirements and gave medical staff clearer authority to stop unsafe climbs. Leonardo Martinez, 29, died at 27,350 feet while chasing a 19-year speed record. His gear did not fail, the ropes did not break, the mountain did not collapse beneath him. The ropes held, his equipment functioned. The failure occurred inside his body, 1,150 vertical feet below the summit he set out to reach. It was May 24, 2017, during a short summit window on Mount Everest. Conditions above the South Col were considered workable by seasonal standards. Winds remained below forecast limits, visibility was clear, and temperatures were within the expected range for that elevation. Because the window was narrow, multiple teams moved at the same time, compressing traffic above 27,000 feet. One of the teams was led by Victor Havel, 41, a Czech guide operating independently of major commercial outfitters. He marketed his climbs aggressively, advertising guaranteed summits and a near-perfect success rate. Contracts recovered later tied refunds to summit proof, photos, timestamps, and GPS data, rather than safety-based turnaround decisions. Among his clients was Daniel Ruiz, 34, a logistics manager from Spain. He had climbed Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua, but had no experience above 7,000 meters. This was his first Everest attempt. Multiple client statements later revealed an undisclosed practice. Above Camp 4, Havel clipped clients directly to his own harness with a short tether, removing their ability to stop or turn back independently. Former clients said the tether was introduced only in the upper death zone when retreat options were already limited. Just below 28,000 feet, witnesses observed Ruiz begin to fail physically. His pace slowed, then broke completely. He did not fall, but his knees buckled and his upper body folded forward. Oxygen was still flowing, but at a low rate consistent with minimal conservation settings rather than active climbing. Havel stopped briefly. Climbers nearby later reported seeing him adjust his stance and check the tether connection. A descent at that point would have voided the summit guarantee outlined in the client contract. Radio traffic reviewed after the incident indicates that Havel continued upward while maintaining tension on the tether. Each step required him to lean forward and pull Ruiz's weight behind him. Other climbers reported hearing Havel urging movement and counting steps. Ruiz did not respond. His breathing, monitored intermittently by sound and movement, became irregular and then shallow. At that altitude, loss of consciousness often occurs without visible struggle. Ruiz's body gradually went slack. Climbers below reported seeing the tether lose tensions abruptly. Havel stopped and turned. Witnesses positioned above later stated they saw Havel reach down toward the tether connection. Investigators concluded that the tether was unclipped after Ruiz lost consciousness. Witness timing and rope behavior indicated the release occurred at that moment, and Ruiz's body fell. Below them on the same fixed line was Aaron Whitfield, 38, from the United States, ascending independently. Multiple climbers reported seeing Ruiz's body strike Whitfield's shoulder and helmet during the fall. The impact knocked Whitfield off balance. The fixed rope, already under load from climbers above, was forced to absorb two sudden loads out of sequence. Whitfield lost his footing. The rapid change in tension caused the rope to recoil. Several witnesses reported seeing Havel pulled forward almost immediately afterward. Both men were carried downslope and out of sight within seconds. No one reported seeing either regain control. Movement on the route stopped right away. Guides above clipped themselves in and stayed where they were, while the fixed line was checked and secured. No one tried to go down. At that height, with thin air, Cold and other climbers still moving through the area, a recovery attempt was not considered safe or possible. Later that day, once the rope had been stabilized, climbers were allowed to move through the section again. The investigation that followed relied on witness statements, radio logs, oxygen flow records, and client contracts taken from base camp. Reviewers found that tethers had been used repeatedly to pull severely hypoxic clients upward. Oxygen logs showed flow rates that didn't match normal self-climbing, supporting accounts that clients were being physically hauled in the upper death zone. The final report listed Daniel Ruiz's cause of death as cardiac arrest, caused by lack of oxygen, with additional injuries from the fall. Aaron Whitfield and Victor Havel were both declared dead from fall-related injuries. Havel's guiding credentials were revoked after his death, and criminal charges were filed against the company that operated the expedition.